So again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank our member Charles Cash, FAIA, for bringing this opportunity to us. And Charles is both an AIA member and he is with the organization Vital Sites. So I'm going to turn it over to Charles to tell you a little bit about that.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate AIA Kentucky giving us this opportunity to promote and discuss what I think is an incredible opportunity that has happened in Kentucky recently with changes in state law. And you're going to hear all about that, so I'm not going to go into it, but it will be a game changer on the preservation front throughout the state. To talk a little bit about us, and you're going to hear from Heath Seymour, who is the executive director for Vital Sites. And Vital Sites is sort of preservation 3.0. In Louisville, there was the Preservation Alliance, and then following that, Preservation Louisville. And then most recently, the Louisville Preservation Fund, DBA Vital Sites. We were created as a function of the solution to the Whiskey Row crisis. Whiskey Row is the cast iron district that you see here in this slide on the left. It's the 100 block of West Main Street and the site of many of the original distillery and whiskey and bourbon suppliers in the region. We were, at the time, there was a proposal to demolish the building, or the whole block, actually. There was a very major discussion in the community about how to come up with an alternative. And in that discussion, a group decided that as opposed to creating preservation as a charity, preservation should be an investor. And so a group of private citizens and local government created $1 million to invest in Whiskey Row as part of the plan to rehabilitate and save the block. That occurred, and we became an investor in the recreation of what has become a major tourist attraction in downtown Louisville. And our intent in that investment was to do other similar investments around the community as that funding is repaid with interest to invest it in other areas of preservation. And he's going to tell you a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I'll get back to that fund in just a minute. I'm going to mention a couple other projects too. I see the slide here has a couple of ongoing projects that we have, and one of those, the bottom right there, is Brown Memorial AME Church. And so we've recently received a $750,000 preservation grant from the National Park Service Historic Preservation Fund. And this is for the connection to the African American Civil Rights Movement. And we're the project manager on this one. And the first priority there is really the exterior, trying to make sure the building's going to be secure from the elements and that sort of thing. Hopefully some other interior work as well. But we're also using the historic tax credit program to bring in some additional revenues there. And so what can happen there if these credits are received, that can actually open up other future grants. It could be used as a matching fund for grants that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to apply for. So it's a unique potential use of the credits. The other one above there is the Schweitzer Pharmacy building. We have great corner stores all through our historic neighborhoods in Louisville. And this one, we used our funds to purchase and save it from a demolition. And we're hoping to get that in some new hands. And again, these buildings are all great fits for the tax credit program. And our neighborhoods would greatly benefit from seeing those redeveloped. And then back to what Charles was talking about, The last thing we talked about Whiskey Row, and with that, our revolving loan pool was focused exclusively on this one big project. But at the time, we thought maybe we can do something similar, but spread those funds out a little bit. And so now we have another $1 million dedicated to help with repairs of historic homes in some of our neighborhoods that have traditionally received less investments. And these loans are up to $75,000 and are aimed mostly at lower to moderate income folks who need help with repairs in order to stay in their homes. There's a little more flexibility in that, but that's our main target. And the rates max out right now at 2% and are paid back on the transfer of the property. So there's not payments that are ongoing that come along with these loans. So it's a unique opportunity for homeowners. And so this is a brand new program, and we're up and running with that and have our first candidates coming through here real soon. And I think Charles is going to give you some examples. Here's these 5 houses here are examples of the type of properties that you can find in a lot of our historic neighborhoods. Charles, you want to talk about that one?
Yes, this was a good example of the kind of ways we see creating value in preservation. These buildings were slated for demolition as part of a major housing development at the corner of Broadway and Baxter Avenues. And the discussions that we entered into with the developer resulted in these 5 little houses being donated to us, not only because of the preservation concern, but because the tax donation actually made the project make more sense financially for the especially for the sellers who did the donation. So we were able to work an economic solution and then set about rehabbing these buildings for sale. We used the historic tax credit on all 5 of these houses, and we're able to place all of them back into private hands, and they're in continued use today. It's a good example of how both preservation can create value and become an asset to a neighborhood. After we started this project, the houses across the street started being rehabbed. The houses down the street started painting and fixing up. It raised the standards for the entire area. And I hope Preservation Kentucky is our partner in these kinds of endeavors around the state. And if you happen to be dialing in from out in the state, you may want to consult with Preservation Kentucky about local organizations that you could contact for this kind of investment advice or tax credit advice in your locality. Now it's my pleasure to turn the real program over to the person who runs it, Katie Wilborn with the Kentucky Heritage Council. Will be taking you through how the tax credit actually works and how it can be of use, I think, a really valuable tool to the profession. Katie?
Thank you, Charles. Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Wilborn from the Kentucky Heritage Council, here to present on the Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program and some design challenges that we commonly see. And these design challenges typically require additional documentation that you can prepare for your clients. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video to help with the streaming. Okay. Let's see. So before we get started, I want to quickly address my role and the role of this webinar. I am not a tax preparer, and no one on my staff provides tax advice. Our role is to assess if the project complies with the program requirements, not to advise applicants on what might be the most advantageous path for their tax liability. So if you have any tax filing questions, I'd advise you to see the IRS's website or talk to a tax preparing professional. Also, this course does not seek to provide a one-stop shop answer to every design challenge. And the reason being is that we have so many diverse property types in Kentucky. All of these properties are either applying for tax credits or have already received tax credits. Because each building holds its own unique characteristics and historic context, there cannot be a prescriptive method that's applied to all properties and all applications. In this webinar, I'll structure the discussion just like a tax credit application, which consists of 3 main parts. Part 1 is confirming the property's eligibility, and I'll briefly discuss how you can help your client find out if their property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I'll then spend the bulk of this webinar discussing the project application itself, which is the Part 2 form. I'll share some case studies of common design challenges that we see and the documentation requirements that go along with them. Lastly, I'll close with the Part 3 application, which is submitted once the project is complete. I'm then available to answer questions, and feel free to reach out to me after this presentation if anything occurs to you later. So a very quick elevator pitch about the program. The Rehabilitation Tax Credit is a type of investment credit where a historic property owner proposes a project and incurs 24 months of qualified rehabilitation expenses, or as we call them, QREs. Once the project is complete, the property owner will receive a percentage of their investment back to them in the form of an income tax credit. There is a state and a federal program, and we process them both at the Kentucky Heritage Council. The percentage that the property owner receives back is based on how the property will be used once the project is completed. The prerequisite for the tax credit is that the property must be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it must retain its historic integrity. So contemporary infills in historic districts and properties that have been heavily altered will not qualify. There is a process to simultaneously nominate an eligible property while submitting a federal tax credit application, but I will not go into detail on that process in this presentation. We have a GIS tool that went live recently that I will show here in this video. And it will help you assist your clients to find out if the property is listed on the National Register. The GIS tool is located on our website, and when you navigate to the Rehab Tax Credit page, there's a link there. Now, the disclaimer is that this is a preliminary search tool. It does not take into account a property's current condition and if it's undergone inappropriate alterations that diminish its integrity. Also, the map will occasionally be slightly off. In the photographic example to the left, you can see that a building appears to straddle a district boundary. In these cases, you should reach out to our National Register coordinator, Marty Perry, whose email is on the screen, to confirm that the property is eligible. But this is a great tool to quickly check the status of a property. And once you've found the property on GIS, it will list important information such as the resource name. In this example, I've put in our office location, which is listed in the Old State House Historic District. I can then enter that into the National Park Service's website to gather more information, such as boundary maps, the nomination form, and historic photographs. Next, we'll talk about the Part 2. The purpose of the Part 2 is to describe, both in narrative and visual formats, the existing building condition and the proposed work. The proposed work is evaluated using the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. We evaluate for conformance with the 10 standards of rehabilitation based on the property's condition under the applicant's ownership before they start the work. The Part 3 is then submitted after all the work is complete, and the certification of rehabilitation is based on whether the entire project's cumulative effects meet the standards. I will not be conducting a full standards training today due to our time constraints, but will be referencing them throughout. If you are not familiar with the standards of rehabilitation, I highly encourage you to review the resources that have been published by the National Park Service related to the standards and interpreting the standards. I'll go over where to find those resources at the end of this presentation. Although we often conduct preliminary reviews, schedule site visits, and provide informal feedback when requested, the determination that we make on the project is based solely on the application documents provided. That's why it's imperative that each project application be clear, complete, and comprehensive. When we issue a Part 2 application approval, either with or without conditions, It is our agreement with the applicant that the project preliminarily qualifies as a certified rehabilitation. We review and approve projects all year long, and we encourage applicants to reach out as soon as they begin thinking about a rehabilitation project, because work that begins prior to receiving a Part 2 approval is subject to denial. We believe that there is a design-based solution to almost every problem and want to set the project up for success, but we can't provide meaningful feedback if work has already progressed beyond a certain point. At a minimum, the Part 2 application consists of the project description, comprehensive photographs of the building prior to any work beginning under the current ownership, and a floor plan that indicates where each photo was taken. We refer to this floor plan as the photo keyed plan. The Part 2 application is easily the most robust component of the entire process, both for applicants to compile and for us, the Kentucky Heritage Council, to review. Projects that do not propose alterations to the floor plan or horizontal planes can often be submitted with just the photo key plan and do not always require a full drawing set. As mentioned before, the submitted documents are imperative. To make a Part 2 determination, we must go by the written record. Just like a check, the narrative takes precedence over all other supplemental material provided. The Part 2 should include what, where, how much, and why for the project scopes, and work must consider the retention and preservation of existing historic fabric and character. If the written application does not contain enough information or contains ambiguous phrases like if possible or where needed, then the application will be placed on hold until further clarification is provided. We understand that there's often unknowns when working with any property, but the narrative should describe what treatment will be pursued, and if a project must change course during its rehabilitation, the applicant should submit a Part 2 amendment that describes why those changes are needed. In general, we do not know the site or project like you do. The Part 2 serves as your guidebook to us, where you walk us through the property's unique challenges, circumstances, and features, and describe how you are going to treat each one of them. If you're proposing to alter an area, let us know why. If you're proposing to replace something, we want to know how. It's important that this narrative is thorough and detailed, so there are no surprises when the project is complete that could jeopardize a Part 3 approval. The more complex the project, the more documentation is needed for us to fully understand the scope of the project. This is where we really rely on our design professionals, architects, and preservation consultants to assist applicants in producing architectural drawings and developing robust descriptions. For complex projects, a property owner may not have the architectural vocabulary or understanding to fully describe the project. So it's a huge benefit to all parties when architects can clearly articulate the complexities of a project. Some examples of additional documentation that may be necessary include reflected ceiling plans, section drawings, mechanical plans, and even on occasion, renders and mock-ups if the project is proposing significant changes. Some things that we typically do not need for a rehabilitation tax credit are detailed structural specifications and life safety plans. We also do not have jurisdiction over removable elements such as furniture, so we usually do not need furniture, fixture, and equipment plans for those elements which are removable. I'll be highlighting 4 common design proposals that often require additional documentation that you will likely prepare for your client. These case studies are being presented to provide context and a framework on what and why we require. Knowing what scopes may trigger additional documentation can help you prepare accordingly and ensure a timely review of the project that avoids holds and requests for additional information. If you ever have questions about what should be submitted with a project application, you can always reach out to the Kentucky Heritage Council for a preliminary review to better understand the documentation requirements for your particular project. Almost all of the examples provided today are from the National Park Service, so that I'm providing consistency in representing their requirements. The first case study I'll touch on is additions, with a specific emphasis on vertical additions. Any exterior addition to a historic building should be considered in a rehabilitation project only after determining that requirements for the project cannot be successfully accomplished within the existing envelope. You should ask yourself and then explain in the Part 2 narrative, what is the programmatic need for this addition? Is there equipment that cannot be reasonably stored elsewhere? Is there stair and elevator penthouses required? Can the programmatic need be accommodated within the existing square footage without significantly altering the building's significant spaces? If the project's programmatic needs cannot be accomplished within the existing envelope, then an exterior addition may be an acceptable alternative. While new construction, including additions, are not considered a qualifying rehabilitation expense, their proposed construction must still be reviewed and determined compatible with the historic structure for the project's cumulative effects to be assessed and certified. If an addition is programmatically appropriate, there are a few guiding principles that are generally true for vertical additions. Generally, a vertical addition is not appropriate for a historic structure that is less than 4 stories tall, because it will disproportionately disrupt its overall massing, size, profile, and scale relative to its setting. Typically, vertical additions should never be more than 1 story tall and should be set back significantly from all visible planes of the building, so that it is not visible or very minimally visible from various angles along the public right-of-way. The project must meet all the standards of rehabilitation on balance, but additions are specifically defined in standards 9 and 10, which seek to provide guidance on their compatibility and reversibility. The National Park Service has a lot of guidance on additions, and I've included a page here from their preservation brief number 14. While all of these points must be addressed in your proposal, it will be especially helpful for your client and for us as the reviewers if you describe the materials, color, dimensions, and placement of the new addition relative to the historic features. Additions should be compatible, yet clearly differentiated and subordinate to the historic structure. Some documentation that should be provided to help illustrate the proposed addition and how it may be compatible are elevations, roof plans, extensive photographs, both from the street and from the rooftop itself, sections, and mock-ups. Physical mock-ups constructed with story poles and photographed are best, but digital mock-ups can also be helpful if they are representative of the massing and cladding proposed. Similarly, renders and sightline studies can be helpful, but only if they accurately represent the proposal. In the 2 examples on the upper left, the hand-drawn perspective actually does the addition a disservice and does not represent how the addition will be perceived from the public right-of-way, since the perspective is taken from a bird's eye view. The other example in the far left accurately shows a street view perspective, rendered with the size, location, setback, and the proposed cladding and fenestration pattern indicated for the addition. This is an example where the documentation was well done and would likely not need requests for additional information. The example at the bottom right included photographic documentation that helped support that the sightline study submitted was accurately depicted. When a project's addition may pose visibility concerns, the use of physical and digital mock-ups are essential in determining the impact and if the project can be certified as meeting the standards. The example on the far left shows an approved constructed addition that is highlighted in preservation brief number 14. The lower left images outlined in green shows how material cladding can change the visual impact of an addition, and the mock-ups on the far right show how it's imperative to document an addition's visibility from all angles of the public right-of-way. Additions are one of the most difficult scopes, so I cannot stress enough the importance of scheduling a preliminary review meeting and applying to our program prior to starting any work. Additions that proceed without a Part 2 certification are very likely to be denied. As previously stated, Kentucky has a wide variety of building types, and many of these underserving buildings are getting a new lease on life through adaptive reuse. For projects that are proposing to change the historic use, you need to ask and answer in your Part 2 application. What are the primary spaces that define its historic use? How do you move through the building, and what features characterize its history? What are the new programmatic needs, and how can those be accommodated without impacting the historic character? What is the character? For each property, those answers are going to be specific to its context and construction. Usually, what the building was initially constructed for dictates the primary spaces and many of the characteristics that should be emphasized and retained. For a rehabilitation project to be certified, both the interior and exterior characteristics must be considered and celebrated. Spaces should be evaluated for their importance, both architecturally to the building as well as functionally. Architectural expressions of the historic functionality might include the entrances, surface coverings, circulation patterns, cornice and roof details, and windows, just to name a few. While all of the standards of rehabilitation apply, the first 3 standards seek to directly address some of the challenges seen in adaptive reuse. The National Park Service has many interpreting the standards bulletins on adaptive reuse, and have also published specific guidance on the adaptive reuse of educational buildings, as well as altering loft areas and dividing assembly spaces. Not all new uses are compatible with the historic configurations and functionality of historic structures. The historic function should be taken into account when evaluating the appropriateness of a new use. Documentation should be guided by the historic use and highlight how those characteristic features will be retained and preserved in the proposed new use. For example, a Part 2 narrative for a historic hotel's adaptive reuse may focus on the treatment of historic corridors, lobby spaces, and entrances, whereas the adaptive reuse description for a church may focus on the treatments proposed to the primary assembly space and interior volumes. For projects that are proposing a new use, existing and proposed plans are required to understand how the historic circulation patterns and hierarchy of space will be retained or altered. Elevations, sections, and reflected ceiling plans can be very helpful if there are any changes proposed to the ceiling or volume. If a building has a historic assembly space, section drawings are required. It is generally not recommended that assembly spaces be divided. In buildings such as churches and theaters, the assembly space is usually of paramount importance, and the entire building is often defined largely by that interior space. Therefore, it can be difficult to subdivide those spaces without impacting the character of the building as a whole. Some buildings, such as schools or hotels, may have several public assembly spaces where they do not all hold the same importance. The subdivision of one assembly space may have less impact on the overall building, depending on its relative prominence. In the example on the far left, the character-defining features of this interior assembly space was subdivided incompatibly when the floor was raised and intersected with the historic windows. The volume of the entire space was lost, and the proportions of the windows were impacted. In the middle image, the assembly space was retained and is still apparent through the new use as office spaces. While dividing assembly spaces is typically not advised, it is possible. Here's an example of a project that received state and federal tax credits in 2019. The existing features on the left, which characterize the building, such as the windows, sanctuary volume, staircase, and architectural details, were all preserved, while other spaces that were secondary to its historic use, such as the kitchen and education areas shown in red boxes to the bottom left, were able to undergo a greater degree of alteration. Here are 2 more examples that specifically relate to wall finishings. The historic school at the top, which was converted to housing, features characteristic plaster walls, finished ceilings, and primary circulation corridors that were preserved in its new use. Conversely, industrial buildings often had their structural elements exposed and are characterized by those exposed elements within volumetric spaces, as seen in the example to the bottom right, where that industrial character remains. Retaining these character-defining features and programming a new use that is compatible with the historic functionality and features is imperative to receiving a Part 2 approval. Next, we will discuss mechanical, electric, and plumbing systems and the documentation requirements. For the installation of new or updated systems, we need to understand what, where, and how their components will be installed. What effect will the installation have on the historic property? New systems, plumbing, and ductwork must not run across windows or introduce unfinished character to historically finished spaces. Concealed ductwork is typically most appropriate for spaces that were historically finished, whereas exposed ductwork can be appropriate in buildings that historically had exposed structural elements. Installation of systems that cause damage to the historic building or cause a visual loss of character may result in a denial of certification. For us to understand the systems, we require MEP plans that indicate the exact size and location of the systems, as well as sections that show how these systems may be impacting ceiling heights. In most instances, it is preferable to locate HVAC systems in secondary spaces and maintain the full ceiling height and volume of the public corridor areas, as shown in the section drawing in the bottom left. HVAC systems may also be hidden in soffits or in drop ceilings in limited areas, such as kitchens or bathrooms, so long as they are away from windows and other significant architectural features. We essentially need to know, what are these systems going to look like once work is complete, and will that appearance be compatible? Our final case study of the day is substitute materials. The National Park Service has recently published new guidance on this topic. I'll be showing you how to access this recent publication, as well as their other resources at the end of this presentation. The narrative should include the existing conditions and proposed treatment for all materials. Repair must always be prioritized over replacement, but when a material is deteriorated beyond repair, or there is no historic material remaining, a substitute material that matches that which would have been there may be appropriate. You'll need to explain the materials in each space and what treatment is proposed. In general, we need to know what is there, what you've discovered, what you've explored, and what you believe is the best path forward to maintaining the building's overall historic character. To show us this information, we often need specification sheets, photographic examples of where the product has been used before, and sometimes physical material samples. If there are several elements and you're only proposing partial replacement, annotated photos and plans can really help illustrate what and where the work is taking place. For example, if windows are being evaluated, please describe the material, configuration, and condition relative to each window type, and provide an elevation with a color-coded key, as this example shows. This helps us understand each window's condition and assess the proposed treatment. Replacement materials should match the historic character in size, texture, color, configuration, and material, if at all possible. The examples on the left show incompatible replacement materials. Both of the leftmost images depict spaces that historically would have been finished. If any work is done in that room, the historically plastered walls should be maintained as a finished space, even if the plaster is deteriorated. Deteriorated plaster can be repaired or replaced with gypsum board, but leaving partially plastered walls or removing deteriorated plaster and not replacing it is not compatible with the standards of rehabilitation. Likewise, the image of the stairwell shows that the historic wood banister and characteristic balustrade were removed and a wall was installed in its place. This does not meet the standards. The range of materials on the market is vast and constantly changing, so we are open to reviewing any proposed material. But please be aware, in our experience thus far, we have not found certain materials to be compatible replacement for historic material. Namely, laminate flooring or LVT products and vinyl windows do not appropriately replicate a historic wood floor or wood window, respectively. These are generally not considered a compatible substitute material option. Lastly, I'll round out this presentation by talking about the Part 3 application. After you receive your Part 2 approval, you'll proceed with the work as described and potentially conditioned if we had to issue conditions. And the applicant will then have 24 months to capture qualifying rehabilitation expenses for their tax credit. Once the entire rehabilitation project is complete and the building is placed in service, you'll submit a Part 3 application, which consists of the application form and photos of the completed work. It's best to synchronize your Part 3 photos with the Part 2 photos, meaning you'll take the completed project photos from the same angles and submit them in the same order that you submitted your Part 2 photos. This makes it really easy for our reviewers and cuts down unnecessary time. The example seen here shows a synchronized photo set, where the photo on the left shows the space before rehabilitation, and the photo on the right shows the space after rehabilitation, taken from approximately the same place and labeled the same number in the photo form submitted. When you submit a Part 3 application, there are usually 3 possible outcomes. One outcome, which is what we all want to see, is the Part 3 application will be approved as a certified rehabilitation project, and the applicant will be awarded tax credits. If the project does not substantially meet the standards, then the project could be denied. The last outcome is remediation. Remediation is an option when a project does not currently meet the standards, but could meet the standards with changes. Remediation is not always an option if the work completed is irreversible and does not meet the standards. But when work can be remediated, it provides the applicant an opportunity to make changes to the non-complying portions of the project so that it can meet the standards and be approved. In this example here, the mechanical systems were incompatible with the historic character of the space. Although many positive treatments were accomplished here, such as refinishing the original floors, restoring the arch sash windows, and restoring the historic ceiling heights, the installation and placement of exposed ductwork was deemed incompatible. Remediation for the ductwork to be concealed and placed in a more appropriate location was an agreed upon method to ensure the project could be approved and awarded tax credits. There are so many great resources on the tax credit program, rehabilitation treatments, and appropriate design interventions. So I'm going to show you where to find all those publications that I've mentioned today on the National Park Service website. The National Park Service has a Technical Preservation Services division, and their website is a great assistance. I particularly like the Preservation by Topic Index, which you'll see shortly in this video. And this lists all of the resources on one page. So for instance, if I was interested in information on substitute materials, I could click on the S for index and go down to substitute materials and find all of their resources related to that topic there. This is a really great one-stop shop for all the resources that you may need to help assist you in your design descriptions and design interventions. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'm available to answer any questions now or later. please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have about the Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program.